Hello and welcome to MRU's celebration for International Women's Day, hosted by the Faculty of Business and Communication Studies and Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. My name is Dr. Rachael Pettigrew, and I'm an assistant professor in the General Management and Human Resources Department at Bissett School of Business. As we begin, we are lucky today to have Dr. Susan Prentice. She's the Duff Roblin Professor of Government at the University of Manitoba. And I want to begin by acknowledging that Mount Royal University is located on the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai, and the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as being home to Métis Nation 3. Welcome, Susan. Thank you for joining us today as part of our International Women's Day event and here to join me to talk about COVID-19, women's employment, and the critical role of childcare. We're thrilled to have you. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah. All right. So as we begin, you have some slides to share that you wanted to give us a little bit of a rundown of the lay of the land on what we're seeing in women's employment, childcare, and COVID.
I do. So I'm a childcare policy researcher and I work on work and family. And although much of my work is policy analysis and qualitative, I find that being sure that we all are on the same page with some basic data points really helps to make an informed conversation. So if you and your audience will indulge me for a few minutes, I thought I could run through some very high order facts about work, women, employment, and childcare, and that will set us up for a really smart and evidence-based conversation. So I'll start sharing my screen and we can move through some slides together.
Terrific.
So COVID-19, women's employment, and the critical role of childcare, brought to you by me. I really want to just give this as a context because there are some very important things that I would think that savvy business leaders, which are many of the students and colleagues you're working with, really need to know. And I'll do 3 takeaway points here and I'll wrap up with them, different ones, but close at the end. So it's really important to understand the ways that the current pandemic and virus have really been cratering women's labor force participation. And this harms not only women, but also Canada's recovery. It's been especially hard on the mothers of young children, all children, but especially preschool aged children, because of the lack of childcare, which gives us some clues that childcare is going to be a part of a recovery strategy. And that we all have an interest in promoting good public policy that can take care of this care foundation on which our economy rests. So with this as a preamble, I thought I would move rapidly through some of the emerging things we know about COVID and childcare pre-COVID. The Royal Bank of Canada has given us some terrifying numbers. Women are falling out of the labor force. They are being much harder hit than men are. So this is women in general, of course. Some women will be even harder hit than women in general. And one of the real challenges of this, you probably know this from data, is that you can be unemployed if you're looking for a job, but if you're unemployed and not looking for a job, you've just fallen out of the labor market. So we also know that in addition to being unemployed, a number of women, particularly those in prime childbearing age, rearing age, are just exiting the labor market. They're not even showing up in our unemployment numbers. So the labor force is being hard hit. Women are taking the biggest crunch, and economists have called this a she session. It's one of the only modern economic recessions that's hitting women's jobs harder than men's jobs. And of course, this comes on top of a labor market that even pre-COVID had occupational segregation and wage gaps and really lacked women in their proper proportions in leadership and other kinds of positions. And the challenge, of course, is that Canadian women have been in the labor force for decades. Not everybody, I think, fully gets how much women mothers work. So I just can't resist giving you some employment rates of mothers by age of youngest child. These data come to us from 2019, so they're pre-COVID numbers. But this is a pattern that's slowly been inching up over the years. So even when children are babies, under 2, overall in Canada, more than 7 out of 10 mothers is in the labor market. Alberta is a titch lower at 66%, and Quebec, for reasons I'll talk about, is much higher at 80%. By the time children are preschoolers, it's closer to 8 out of 10 mothers is in the labor market Canada-wide. Again, slightly lower in Alberta and higher in Quebec. And then by the time children are school age, it's pretty equalized across Canada, Alberta, and all the provinces kind of manage out as children become more school aged. But we still organize the world as though the working mother was an exception, that the work day can really be organized around a mom at home, and that childcare is kind of a private responsibility. This strikes me as astonishing culture lag and decision makers that haven't kept up with modern realities. So what do these mothers do? You have children, you're in the labor market. What do you do? Well, you use childcare. That's what most mothers will try to do. And Canada does not have enough licensed childcare spaces. Countrywide, we can only serve about 28% of the children, 0 to 12. And anybody who remembers back to their babysitting days knows that 12 is the magic age. At the age of 12, you can be a babysitter and you can be left alone. But before that, it's actually illegal to leave children alone. Alberta's worse than the national average. Alberta has a licensed childcare spaces for just 22% of your children 0 to 12. And there's nothing magic about this. Quebec, by public policy decisions, can be twice as good. They can serve more than 4 out of 10 children. So there's not enough childcare. You've got all these working mothers. We don't have enough childcare. And when you can find it, it costs a lot of money. Basically, childcare in Canada is mostly like wanting carrots for dinner. If you want carrots for dinner tonight, you go to the grocery store and you buy them. And if you're a working parent and you want childcare, you go to the market and you buy it. And in Calgary, if you're paying for infant childcare, you're averaging median $1,300 a month, and a little less for a preschooler. Not as bad as Toronto, where you're paying close to $1,800 a month, but more than we pay here in Winnipeg, $651 a month, but many times more expensive than Quebec, which can give childcare to 40% of the children for less than $180 a month. So I hope these numbers give you a sense of the dazzling problem, right? Most mothers work. We don't have enough childcare. The childcare we have is expensive. And so I give you this chart, which comes from an American calculator. It's the American Center for Progress, which tries to answer this question. Okay, so there's not enough daycare and it costs too much. Maybe a mother could just stay home. Maybe she could just stay home. So we have a hypothetical teacher here, somebody who might have been making $44,000 a year and who might leave the labor market at the age of 26 and stay out of the labor market till her kid turns 6. Maybe she's a teacher, an American teacher. Believe it or not, American teachers at the 25th percentile only earn $44,000 a year. So over the 6 years, this is just some math for us. She will lose not only the lost wages of her annual salary, which is a little over $250,000, she loses out on projected wage growth, which is an opportunity cost, and retirement assets and benefits. So the price to a mother of staying home out of the labor market to manage this crisis of inaccessible and unaffordable childcare is hugely expensive. The 6 years that this mother might hypothetically stay out is going to cost her over a lifetime, over $800,000. So one of the things this shows, I think, is how much we privatize this crisis of childcare and how much it's carried on the backs of mothers, which strikes me as enormously unfair and therefore a very fine topic for International Women's Day. This is an American calculator, so it's predicated on American Social Security and the rest. Believe it or not, we don't actually have something you could plug yourself into for Canada, but it is a project on my to-do list. I give this to you to show that it's not just like a problem that could be privately solved. Mm-hmm. So it's an iceberg, right? Here we have this visible above the waterline problem of mothers leaving the labor market through COVID as they struggle with job losses and taking care of children. In Manitoba, schools and daycares were closed for more than 3 months, just putting a huge burden on mothers. But this crisis is always ready to be triggered, right? Because the formal economy rests on this invisible, unsupported, under the waterline work done by women. It's always been there. It's always been a part of women's economic vulnerability. It's just more obvious right now in an era of COVID. The formal above the waterline economy is only a part of the full real economy. So what I hope we get to leave your guests with at the end of today is that this she session is extraordinary, but it's not unsurprising because all these vulnerabilities pre-exist. That women and differently situated women are really hard hit, and that's not fair. And that employers alone actually can't solve this either, that we all need to be getting behind good public policy. So that's my little walk through the data at a very high level to set us up for this conversation. I'll stop sharing and we can turn this into a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on board with all of that. I think it's, then you combine kind of the long-term impacts. So you had identified the loss of income and loss of potential assets and other things. What other long-term impacts other than financials can you envision for women's leaving the workforce?
Well, huge losses to Canada of investments in highly educated women's training, right? So foregone public dollars when a highly trained person has to leave the labor market. Her personal frustrations, right? A long time ago, Betty Friedan called it a problem that had no name, right? This person at home who wants to be doing more. It produces inequality in many marriages, right? A higher income earner and a lower income earner often means that they have different decision-making power, different kinds of vulnerabilities. Possibly when everything is good, it's a fine compromise to have the 1.5 job family. Somebody has a career and somebody has a small job. But if that partnership ends through death or divorce or some other reason, it's the woman who's left economically much more vulnerable. Children learn that mothers are the small job and dads are the big job, because still overwhelmingly the wage gap means that it's women who earn less than their male partners. So basically, it's just a mess of inequality and lost opportunity and frustrated mothers, and it's fairly solvable with good public policy.
And it also perpetuates the really extreme general expectations, but through modeling, right? So perhaps even now we're seeing some social shifts where 60% of university grads in Canada are women. And some of the recent stats show that roughly 30% of women now out earn their partners, at least in heterosexual relationships. And so we're seeing a real shift, a potential shift. But is the she session? Oh my gosh, tongue tied. Is the recession that's impacting women? Is that going to set that back? Because possibly there could be shifts. If when you look at how earning potential influences how we divide our care and work responsibilities, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, very, very clearly, it's a crisis inflection point. I mean, many more mothers are leaving the labor force than fathers. So there's that evidence right there. But we know from a long history that when family care needs come up against the job, it's women who moderate their labor force much more than men. Canada's had parental leave that dads can take for a very long time. And I don't have to tell you that very few dads take advantage of that. We know that women do part-time work, both pushed and pulled much more than men do. Women leave the labor market for longer. And, it carries lifelong into lower pensions in old age. So there are very long-term consequences to this.
And we're really seeing, in that elderly category for women, it's a huge proportion of the women living within poverty are living within poverty at the end of life. So, a 5 or 6 year work interruption when you're 30 might not seem like it has an influence, but it has that ripple effect to end of life, especially if someone ends up, due to divorce or death on their own at the end of life.
Indeed. And this is, of course, this talk we're doing today is looking at the young person end of the care economy, the work required for young children. But COVID's also showing us how much older people in Canada rest on family and kin care. It's largely middle-aged daughters who are doing the work of providing care for their parents and their in-laws. And so this sandwich generation is often squished both by the demands of young children and aging parents. So that's a whole other aspect of the care economy that's under the waterline, but it's all a part of the same piece, which is to say that this unpaid work that women have done for decades that kind of keeps the formal economy going has reached a tipping point, which is that it's not working very well. It's putting too much pressure on women, and there's growing interest in public policy changes.
Yeah. So that leads me right to the next question. What is, you and I probably likely agree on this, but we've seen some changes in the recent years around parental leave and the addition of the shared parental benefit. But what other policies and practices do you think at a government level need to be implemented in order to, I mean, we take some cues from Quebec, but what are your thoughts on how we can fix this from a policy or legislation perspective?
Right. So, at a high order, it's a very simple instruction. Oh, Canada needs progressive family policy. That's a short takeaway. But concretely, what that looks like is that parental leaves and childcare are very integrated. Canada made a dumb decision in 1971 when we hooked maternity leave onto what was then called unemployment insurance. So even though you definitely had a baby, you only got some money to stay home if you were eligible for what was then called UI. We've kept that link ever since. So outside of Quebec, not much more than half of women are eligible for employment insurance. This has to do with the changing labor market. So even though you definitely had a baby or adopted a baby, you can definitely not get any money to stay home. So that's one problem. When you do stay home, we don't pay enough, right? It's a restricted amount, up to 55% of your previous salary to a cap. So it's not enough to live on. Or you can stretch that little amount of money now over 18 months, although that's just as hard. Yep. Because you lose income when you stay home, many families take a look at their checkbooks and say, well, whose salary can we sacrifice less painfully? And it's almost always the lower income salary, which tends to map onto the woman. So we have low rates of men taking up paid parental leave, even though it's available. So that's one problem. We need we need more accessibility to better paid parental leaves. And then we have to ensure that there are childcare services for that moment when leaves end and folks go back into the labor market. Quebec shows us that you don't have to be Sweden to do this, right? With good public policy, you can create accessible, affordable childcare. Economists have even showed us that 20 years of evidence from Quebec has shown that because you can create spaces which are affordable and accessible, mothers will enter the labor market at higher rates. More workers means more taxes. And Quebec actually, if you can believe this, pulls a profit from its childcare system. Every year it recoups more in increased taxes than it pays out to have its childcare. So there aren't even economic reasons against investing in childcare services. That would take care of birth and babies. There's elder care at the end of life, but that's somebody else's topic, not today.
As well, Quebec, I mean, we really do look at the feasibility. I recently finished a research project looking at employers' perceptions of the extended parental leave. And employers were saying, well, nobody wants it because it's not affordable. So they're not worried about, to a great extent, 18-month leaves because they won't be used. But again, because that wage replacement is so low, and then we're stretching it over 18 months, it actually reduces the incentive for men to use it, because men, research shows, take leaves when the wage replacement is higher, like offered in Quebec and Sweden and other places. Yeah.
European research has shown that longer leaves also tend to be kind of bad for women's careers, that job skills can get rusty, you can lose your connection to your job. The best advice seems to be shorter, better remunerated, and more shared leaves work better than longer, poorly paid leaves. I mean, the labor market differentiates a bit, right? If you have a crummy minimum wage job, maybe you'd rather stay home at 55% of that. But then you start to see real class stratification, right? Which is that lower income, more marginalized jobs, you might see women taking longer unpaid leaves and professional women not. So then there's also class effects by family income. It all gets very complicated, but the gist of it is that Canada's never really taken family policy seriously and hasn't seen it as a part of economic policy. And so it's been privatized. Private families have been forced to manage it, or some employers have tried to figure out themselves how to do it. But it's a bit like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. No one employer could possibly meet these needs without a public policy foundation.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Can we discuss for a moment kind of the intersectionality behind this? So we talked about generalities around, what generally might be the impact, but we know that there are going to be groups that are more, the hit is going to be harder for COVID and employment in women.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can start with the jobs women do, right? The Canadian labor market's quite occupationally segregated. That's social speak for saying that women and men tend to do different kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
And those jobs tend to be differentially paid. So right away, we know there's a differential labor market. We know that women have higher rates of part-time work than men do, largely to manage those care responsibilities. Many of those jobs are precarious. They don't come with benefits. They tend to be lower paying. They're the kind of jobs where you can discover, even though you've been working, because of the magic of the formulas required for employment insurance, that you're EI ineligible. So these, of course, means that people who are marginalized on other axes, it's doubled in the labor market, right? So racialized women, newcomers, new Canadians, Indigenous women, certainly, minority language groups, women with disabilities. We haven't done as good a job as we should on collecting the data, but there's every reason to know that these sorts of stratifications compound gender relations in the labor market. It's also true that, I just want to say that many of the folks who provide the care work that helps other folks manage the care work are themselves racialized and marginalized women. So here's a painful one. There is no post-secondary education you can do in Canada that will get you a lower return on your tuition than working in childcare. Like you get almost no return for an early childhood education. We've watched in long-term care homes, the poor pay of the folks who take care of senior citizens in Canada, right? So these relationships compound.
Yeah, and one of the other discussions in our International Women's Day event is actually discussing COVID's impact on women in refugee and newcomer women. So I look forward to that conversation too. I think we do see a lot of the newcomers overrepresented in those care facilities, right? And then there's always a take or a critique that, well, why are they working at multiple facilities? But the truth is they're not getting a full-time employment at one facility. And so in order to cover their expenses, they're working at multiple locations.
Right.
Yeah. I think
can I add to that, Rachel? So one of them, of course, is there are, I would say, dishonorable employers who use legislation, employer required legislation to manage that. By keeping people below a minimum threshold, you can put a ceiling on benefits. And so there are unscrupulous employers who take advantage to exploit that. So greater labor protections for all workers would go some way, as would better minimum wage rules. I think we mythologize the minimum wage worker as some kid working at the modern version of a soda fountain, but it's not true. Very often it's a middle-aged mother supporting a family.
Yeah, absolutely. And saying that, I mean, you were mentioning that you think Canada in general hasn't taken family policy as seriously as it should, but also kind of thinking about childcare workers, right? So ECEs, or early childhood educators, which is such a, as a mom of two school-age kids, I understand what an amazing role they have in supporting the development of young children in their care facilities. And both of my children went to care. But how do we restructure that to make sure that they're getting the money back on their degrees, right? And getting a proper wage so that we have people in those care facilities giving very important work that is actually being recognized in the salary they're receiving.
Well, there is a way out of it, but it requires following the data and not being blinded by gender beliefs and gender stereotypes. I showed you the fees that parents are paying. I mean, in order for a childcare worker, an early childhood educator, to make more money in Calgary or Toronto or even Montreal, those parent fees that are paid every month, which can easily top out over $18,000 a year, you can't actually put that on individual parents.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to move to a system where we see childcare less as a market product and more as a public service. You know, over 100 years ago, most of Canada decided we needed public education, and we created mass services for all people. A little over half a century ago, we made a similar decision about healthcare. My belief is that it's coming for childcare. We're just not quite there yet. So as long as we have a market model where the assumption is, you know, you want it, you pay for it, it's private, we will never be able to break this logjam of high fees and low wages. Only direct public funding can break that logjam. And it's done around the world, but not very much in Canada.
Because really in Canada, our fertility rate, the number of children that the average woman will have in her childbearing lifetime, is really constrained by childcare costs, right? So we're really limited by, you know, how much we can afford and still work or drop out of the labor market, but then you're facing the risks that we discussed earlier. Yeah. So I have a final question, I guess, that is just exploring. The audience for this is MRU students and recent grads, and maybe this is a two-part question, so I'll ask the first part. But what advice do you have, given our conversation? I mean, this might get personal, but what advice do you have, given our conversation around this? Would you give to current students or early grads as they start to navigate their career?
Well, as citizens of Canada, or residents of Canada, potential citizens of Canada, and people who are parents, because of course 1 in 10 university students is a parent, and in fact 3 out of 10 Indigenous post-secondary students is a parent. As parents, they're going to, this is going to wallop them if they haven't thought of this. I think most people believe that, you know, many young men and women today, I think, believe that the struggles of the 60s and 70s were behind us. Surely that women's movement made all those gains, and it's all done. And to hit a labor market that's segregated, where there are what we call glass elevators and glass ceilings, some rise and some don't, wage segregation, and then a care economy that privatizes. This is a painful reality, and it's hard on people, and it's not fair on them personally. So get ready and use your vote. If nothing else, that's how people make their voices heard. Yeah. But as educated people, they're going to be in decision-making positions. They'll be employers. They'll be working in organizations where they get to influence policy. And this is where I hope people take some of these data lessons seriously, which is that you know these problems that have social structural roots can't just be solved voluntarily and by goodwill. They take structural solutions. And that's really where Canada needs contemporary modern family policy for a modern economy.
Yeah. And, you know, possibly, and my research has been focused on parental leave, and also, you know, sharing parental leave, I think, is a really good thing to start thinking about ahead of time. And many students are not, those who are not parents are not thinking about that far ahead. But often, you know, mate selection, sharing priorities and long-term, sharing long-term perspectives around how we divide those care costs and opportunity costs for having children in a way that kind of maintains equality or equity within the relationship, right?
Absolutely. So, it's a bit early to tell, but there's some emerging coverage of the fact that as more moms and dads together are home trying to keep the kids alive and from killing each other while getting their jobs done, that the penny is dropping for fathers as well. And with any luck, that also helps to move a conversation further than it has historically tended to be.
Yeah, there's been some great research that's happening during this window of time around, you know, who's contributing what, and some mixed results, but some indication that they're now observing, at least, and people are aware of all the care and the minutia that's managed on a regular basis as well. And so the final follow-up question to that is, why should students care about policy? I love policy. I study it. I know you do as well. But how can we encourage them to be more engaged in policy and the development of policy?
That's been the question of my career, Rachel. I think we live in a world that encourages us to not look much beyond the end of our nose and to just think that our private life is our private life and these are just private choices and it's just your private little family. And I think that what we call in my side of the table of sociological imagination allows us to see how your private life and your public life really are very connected, and there are constraints and there are possibilities. And I think if we all want a life of more freedom, we need to think about enabling environments. There will be parents who will want to stay home with their children, but there will be other parents who will want the chance to have the high quality care that they currently can't find or afford. And we don't do anybody any favors when we constrain the choices that limit our lives. So we'll all be happier, frankly, and it will be a more just economy. Those strike me as powerful reasons to care about policy.
I think that's an amazing way to finish. I could talk to you for 3 hours and just enjoy our conversations. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts on COVID, women, and childcare in our International Women's Day event for MRU this year. Really appreciate having you here and look forward to future conversations.
My pleasure.